What would happen if the only person who could save a multi-million-dollar deal was the one who had never been invited into the boardroom? Not the director, not the chief engineer, but a 27-year-old young man with grease-stained hands and a name no one had ever bothered to remember. Just one sentence he spoke that day made the entire room fall silent and changed his life forever. If you've ever been underestimated, this story might be exactly what you need to hear today. That afternoon, Dallas was drenched in the harsh golden sunlight of a Texas summer. Inside one of the city's most prestigious luxury supercar dealerships, everything operated as usual. Soft background music, the scent of new leather, sharply pressed suits, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Then the automatic glass doors slid open. No noise, no display, just a very brief moment, but enough to shift the rhythm of the entire room. Victoria Kane stepped inside. 52 years old, founder of a multi-billion-dollar electric vehicle corporation in Silicon Valley. A woman who is frequently mentioned in Forbes, Bloomberg, and every central financial forum. But what made people cautious around her wasn't her wealth, it was her precision. Victoria was known for never asking small-talk questions. When she entered a place, she came with a clear purpose, and she expected preparation to match it. Her security team followed a few steps behind. The dealership staff immediately adjusted their posture, their smiles turning more formal. The manager hurried forward, extending his hand with polished enthusiasm. "We are truly honored to welcome you." Victoria gave a slight nod. No handshake, no unnecessary words. Her gaze settled at the center of the showroom, where a rare classic engine block was displayed, promoted as a collector's masterpiece. She walked toward it, slowly, examining every detail. And then she began asking questions. Not the kind of typical customer would ask. She asked about restructuring the cooling system, about the possibility of upgrading the RPM regulator to comply with California emission standards, about whether the current housing could withstand the pressure if hybrid technology were integrated. Those questions were not in the sales script. The staff's smiles began to falter. No one answered immediately. The air grew heavier with each passing second. Victoria folded her arms. She did not appear irritated, but her eyes made one thing clear. She was waiting for an answer worthy of her time. And in that silence, everyone began to realize. Perhaps they had underestimated this afternoon. The first few seconds passed so slowly that you could even hear the hum of the air conditioning above the ceiling. The dealership manager cleared his throat, trying to maintain his usual confidence. He began speaking about certified quality, about a highly experienced technical team, about Texas's premier service commitment. Smooth, flawless phrases. Yet they completely missed the question Victoria had just asked. She didn't interrupt. She simply looked straight at him, a look powerful enough to make the other person wonder, "Do I truly understand what I'm saying?" Another sales associate stepped forward, attempting to add a few technical specifications printed on the brochure. He read almost word for word from what had been prepared. But when Victoria asked about the maximum combustion chamber pressure after integrating the upgraded hybrid system, he froze. Not because the question was too complex, but because it wasn't in the script. The atmosphere began to shift. A few customers browsing cars in the distance paused as well. They realized this was no longer a routine consultation. This was a test. Victoria took another step toward the engine block. She pointed at the airflow regulator. "Has this component been recalibrated?" she asked, her voice calm yet razor sharp. No one answered immediately. One employee glanced at the manager. The manager glanced at the showroom technician. The technician lowered his eyes to the floor. That moment was the most dangerous silence of all. In business, Mistakes can be corrected, but some silences fracture trust instantly. Victoria did not show anger. She simply exhaled softly. A single breath, enough for the entire room to sense that an opportunity was slipping away. Behind the glass partition separating the showroom from the garage, a figure stopped working. He listened. Technical terms echoed, questions without answers. And he knew. The woman wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. She was simply looking for someone who truly understood machinery. While in the front, the neatly tailored suits were still trying to preserve their composure, in the back, a decision was quietly taking shape. Because sometimes, a silent room isn't lacking people who can speak. It's lacking someone willing to say what is right. Behind the transparent glass that separated the glamorous showroom from the oil-scented garage, Ethan Brooks was still bent over an old SUV. Fluorescent lights cast a pale glow onto the stained concrete floor. The soft clink of metal against metal, the steady turn of tools. That was his familiar world. No red carpet, no judging eyes, just machinery and truth. Ethan was 27 years old, born in a small town in Oklahoma where dreams often had to make way for utility bills. When he was 17, his father lost his job after the factory shut down. College became a luxury they couldn't afford. He chose to work as a helper at a local garage, gradually learning to listen to engines the way others listened to heartbeats. No one taught him through formal textbooks. He learned from old manuals bought for a few dollars. From technical forums where people debated until 2 in the morning, from hours-long videos about combustion chamber structures and drivetrain systems. He didn't have degrees hanging on a wall. But he had something more important, a curiosity that refused to sleep. When Victoria's questions echoed from the showroom, Ethan paused. The wrench in his hand stopped midair. He recognized every technical term, every detail she mentioned. And he knew. She was right. The issue wasn't the polished appearance of that engine block. It was in the unseen details, the subtle misalignment in the airflow regulation system, the risk of overload when integrating hybrid technology without reinforcing the housing. He looked up through the glass. On the other side were perfectly pressed suits. On this side, a grease-stained jacket and safety boots worn thin at the heels. Ethan understood his place in this building very clearly. He was just the garage mechanic, the one who fixed things, not the one who spoke. But there was something greater than insecurity. It was the discomfort of watching a correct question go unanswered. His heart began to beat faster. He could keep his head down, finish the job, and pretend he hadn't heard anything. Or he could walk through that door, where the lights were brighter but colder. There are moments in life when opportunity doesn't knock. It simply stands quietly on the other side of the glass, waiting for you to be brave enough to open it. Ethan set the wrench down. The soft sound of metal touching the workbench echoed faintly, but inside him, it felt like a loud bell ringing. On the other side of the glass, the tension was rising. Victoria still stood there, her gaze patient but running out of time. The showroom staff had begun speaking over one another, trying to fill the silence with roundabout explanations. Ethan knew one truth very clearly. In this world, not everyone who understands is allowed to speak. He looked down at his hands, grease embedded deep into every line of his skin. He remembered the times he had suggested minor improvements in the garage only to have them dismissed as unnecessary. He remembered the looks implying he should simply stick to his role. Part of him wanted to return to the old SUV, finish his shift, collect his paycheck at the end of the month, live a safe, modest life. But there was something in that woman's eyes that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the gaze of someone wealthy demanding privilege. It was the gaze of someone searching for the truth. Ethan took a deep breath. What if I'm wrong? What if they laugh at me? What if this is the step that costs me my job? The questions crashed over him like waves. But then another thought slipped in, quieter yet stronger. What if I'm right? He wiped his hands on the old rag hanging at his side. His first step toward the glass door felt heavier than usual. He could clearly sense the invisible division within this building. The showroom in front, polished, polite, distant. The garage in back, noisy, dusty, but honest. The glass door wasn't locked. It had never been locked. No one had simply thought to open it. Ethan pushed the door. A small click sounded, enough to make a few people turn. One employee frowned. The manager's expression tightened slightly. Ethan stepped out, the showroom lights briefly stinging his eyes. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't tremble, it was simply clear enough. Ma'am, if you'll allow me, I believe I understand the issue you're referring to. The room fell silent. It wasn't just a sentence. It was the moment an ordinary man chose to step beyond the boundary others had drawn for him. And sometimes, that very moment is the actual turning point of destiny. The entire room nearly froze. The dealership manager frowned slightly as if Ethan's presence were an act of overstepping. One employee whispered something under his breath, his eyes unable to hide his irritation. In that space filled with elegant lighting, Ethan's grease-stained jacket had never looked more out of place. Victoria did not speak immediately. She looked Ethan up and down, not with disdain, but with the gaze of someone assessing, not based on clothing, but on the eyes. "You understand the issue I'm referring to?" she asked calmly. Ethan gave a slight nod. He stepped closer to the engine block. He didn't touch it right away, he simply observed, the way he always did when approaching an unfamiliar vehicle, listening before acting. "The problem isn't on the surface," he said slowly. "The airflow regulator appears fine, but if you integrate the hybrid system as you mentioned, the pressure will shift toward this housing, and without reinforcement, it will develop cracks after a period of operation." There were no more whispers, no more overlapping explanations. Only his voice, low, clear, and steady. Victoria stepped closer. "Then in your opinion, what's the solution?" Ethan did not avoid her gaze. He pointed to the junction between two components and explained that recalibrating the rotary valve would more evenly distribute pressure. He suggested changing the material at a minor point, a detail the brochure had never mentioned. The employees behind them began exchanging looks. This was no longer an impulsive remark. This was real knowledge. Victoria posed another question, more complex, more challenging. Ethan answered immediately. No performance, no attempt to prove himself superior, just saying exactly what needed to be said. And in that moment, what was unfolding was more than a technical exchange. It was a quiet shift of power. No one announced it. No one acknowledged it out loud, but everyone felt it. The garage mechanic who had stepped through the glass door was no longer an outsider. Actual value, when placed in the correct position, does not need to be loud. It makes the entire room listen to itself. Victoria said nothing further. She simply tilted her head slightly, signaling for Ethan to continue. "Can you open that housing?" A short question, but to those standing around it was an unspoken permission and also a test. Ethan knelt beside the engine block. He removed his old glove and set it aside. His movements were slow, familiar, not rushing to prove himself, not trembling under the weight of the entire room's gaze. He opened the side panel. The screws were removed neatly. The metal cover lifted with a soft click, revealing the internal structure beneath. Everyone leaned forward. Victoria stepped closer. Ethan bent down, examining carefully. The showroom lights reflected off the polished metal surface. To an untrained eye, everything looked perfect. Not a single major scratch, no obvious sign of damage. But Ethan wasn't searching for the obvious. He was searching for what had been overlooked. A few seconds passed. Then he stopped. His finger lightly touched an almost invisible line along the inner edge of the housing. "Here," he said quietly. The entire room fell silent. "This is a micro crack. It's not a major issue yet, but if the pressure increases when integrating the hybrid system, it will spread. After a few months of operation, the entire system could shift out of alignment." One employee stepped closer, bending down to look. It took him several seconds before he could even see the faint fracture line. Victoria crouched down as well. The distance between her and Ethan was now only a few dozen centimeters. She examined it closely, very closely. And then she looked up. Her expression had changed. No longer scrutiny, but recognition. "The engineering team inspected it before," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "They may have focused on the major specifications. Details like this are easy to miss." No one spoke further. This silence was different from before. It was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of realization. A small detail, an almost invisible crack, yet that very detail had revealed something far more critical, the ability to see what others could not. And in that moment, everyone understood. This was no longer a story about an engine. It was a story about a talent being seen for the very first time. Victoria straightened up. She did not rush to say anything, as if weighing a decision more important than the deal in front of her. The entire room remained in silence. The employees who had once tried to fill the space with polished phrases now stood behind, watching. No one interrupted. No one attempted to reclaim control. Victoria looked at Ethan for a few more seconds. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. "Almost 8 years," Ethan replied. His voice remained steady, but his heart pounded harder than ever. "Do you have an engineering degree?" Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm self-taught." A few expressions behind him subtly shifted. Self-taught. In places like this, that phrase was often dismissed. Victoria did not seem surprised. "Do you know," she said slowly, "that I'm building a next-generation hybrid restoration division in California?" Ethan paused. This was no longer a technical question. This was a turn in another direction. "I need people who understand machines instinctively. People who don't just read specifications, but can hear when a system is crying for help." The room seemed to stop breathing. Victoria looked directly at Ethan. "Would you like to join my team?" No one had prepared for those words. Not the manager, not the staff, and certainly not Ethan. An offer like that does not come to an ordinary garage mechanic, at least not in the usual way. For a few seconds, everything around him seemed to blur. The hum of the air conditioning, the sound of footsteps, even the breathing in the room, all of it faded into the background. He thought of his mother, still working 2 shifts a day. He thought of their small apartment, of the stacked bills. He thought of the times he had been asked, "Why didn't you go to college like everyone else?" This opportunity wasn't just a new job. It was a doorway into an entirely different world. But stepping through that doorway would also mean leaving behind the safety he had always known. Victoria did not rush him. She simply waited. The respect with which she waited made the moment feel even more serious. Because sometimes an offer can change your life, but the decision to step forward must still be your own. No one said a word. That luxurious room suddenly became the place where Ethan could hear his own heartbeat most clearly. The offer still hung in the air. It wasn't a compliment. not a temporary reward, but a turning point. Ethan swallowed. He had never imagined standing in a moment like this. A technology billionaire was waiting for an answer from him, not from the manager, not from the engineering team, but from him. He looked down at his hands. The grease stains were still there, the calluses formed over years of labor, the hands that had once been dismissed as not meant for an office. He thought of the small house where his mother still kept the lights on late into the night, doing extra sewing work. He thought of the evenings he had sat alone in front of an old computer screen, learning technical concepts no one graded, no one acknowledged. For years he had grown used to standing in the background, used to fixing things so others could move forward. And now, he was being invited to step forward himself. But a great opportunity always carries great fear. What if I'm not good enough? What if I ruin everything? What if that world isn't meant for me? Those weren't the questions of a weak man. They were the questions of someone who understood the cost of failure. Victoria still stood there. No pressure, no persuasion with attractive numbers. She simply looked at him with the calm of someone who believed in her own choice. "Don't let fear decide for you," she said softly. The sentence wasn't loud, but it was deep enough to reach what Ethan had kept hidden inside. He realized something then. If he refused simply out of fear, he would have to live with the question, what if, for the rest of his life. Ethan took a deep breath. When he looked up again, there was no hesitation in his eyes. "If you believe I can do it, I'm ready." No applause, no fireworks, just a slow nod from Victoria. But in that moment, a life shifted onto a different path. Not because of luck, but because one man chose to step through his fear instead of bowing to it. After Ethan's answer, the atmosphere in the showroom shifted completely. No one applauded, no one gasped in amazement, but everyone understood. They had just witnessed something not easily repeated. Victoria turned to her assistant. Her voice was calm, decisive. "Prepare the contract. We're flying tonight." Tonight. Not next week, not when you're ready. Tonight. A few employees exchanged glances, almost unable to believe it. The manager stepped forward, trying to maintain his professionalism. "Perhaps he needs time to arrange things." Victoria simply raised her hand slightly, not loudly, but enough for the sentence to stop midway. "He'll decide his own affairs." That wasn't just protection, it was respect. Ethan stood there, fully aware of the eyes on him from every direction. The people who had passed him every day without remembering his name, the people who had never asked what he thought. Now they were looking at him as if he were the main character in a story they hadn't expected. He didn't feel pride. He simply felt unfamiliar. Victoria walked toward the door. The automatic glass doors slid open and the Texas afternoon sunlight poured in, warm and radiant. Ethan turned back for one last look. The garage behind the glass, the place where he had spent nearly a decade, where he learned patience, where he had doubted himself, where he had quietly repaired machines so others could continue their journeys. Today, he was leaving, not to escape, but because he had been called forward. A black electric SUV was waiting outside. Victoria tilted slightly, gesturing for him to step in first. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Money can buy power, but respect must be given through trust. As the car door closed, Ethan looked through the window. The faces behind the showroom glass grew smaller and smaller. He was no longer the garage mechanic. He was the man who had dared to step through the door. And sometimes, what changes your life isn't where you start. It's the moment you decide not to stand still anymore. The car pulled away from the dealership, leaving behind the polished glass walls and the stairs that had not yet faded. Ethan sat still for a few seconds. The city of Dallas drifted past outside the window like a slow-motion film. The roads he had driven every day, the familiar intersections, the small diners he used to visit after work, they were all still there. Only he was no longer the same. Victoria sat beside him, opening her tablet to review the schedule. She didn't speak much. She made no extravagant promises. Just before the car merged onto the highway, she turned to him and said, "Greatness doesn't come from where you're born. It comes from the moment you choose to step forward." Ethan looked down at his hands. The hands were once considered too rough, unfit for a boardroom. The hands that had quietly repaired aging machines. Now those very hands were being allowed to build something new. He suddenly understood something simple yet profound. Life doesn't change just because someone offers you an opportunity. It changes because you are brave enough to accept it. Ahead lay California, a team of top engineers, greater challenges, heavier pressure. But for the first time, Ethan did not feel like he was standing outside of some distant world. He wasn't chosen out of pity, not because of luck, but because he had been preparing long before the opportunity appeared. The car continued toward the airport. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a brilliant shade of orange. Some days seem ordinary, until they become the day that changes your entire life. And perhaps, somewhere out there, there is also a glass door waiting for you to open it. The question is not whether you are good enough. It is, when that moment arrives, will you be brave enough to step forward? If this story made you reflect, share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? And what opportunity are you standing in front of right now? If you believe talent can be born anywhere, leave a like. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it with them. And if you want to continue walking alongside stories of choice, courage, and life-changing turning points, subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We will meet again in another story about another moment that might also be waiting for you.